Hello everyone. Tonight we will step into stories that are as strange as they are hard to explain. From the mysterious encounters at the Buffalo Ranch to the dark shadow that haunted the skies over Chernobyl. From the chilling legend of the Bell Witch to the terrifying account of a man lost among the icy Himalayas. Forget the bedtime fairy tales, because these are the stories that will linger in your mind long after the lights have gone out. Before you lie back and get comfortable, be sure to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these mysteries. And don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let us begin tonight's journey together. Number 1. The Buffalo Ranch Encounters. The U.S. state of Colorado carries with it a colorful history filled with strange and inexplicable events. From the San Luis Valley to the towering Rocky Mountains, countless residents have reported bizarre phenomena, ranging from mysterious lights to the unsettling deaths of livestock under circumstances that defy reason. When it comes to his personal life, it would be fair to say that Jeff Sailors has lived a truly extraordinary existence. Together with his longtime partner Patricia, he owns an art gallery in Idaho, where he also runs a workshop devoted to the intricate craft of horsehair hitching. Born in Colorado, Jeff spent much of his boyhood fishing alongside his grandfather, an experience that instilled in him a deep and enduring passion for the natural world. He took up hunting at a very young age, and that passion, combined with his love of the wilderness, would come to define him in the years that followed. At the age of 18, he moved to Montana in search of work, and for the next 50 years he would roam on horseback across the untamed wildlands of America, from the Canadian border all the way down to New Mexico. Over the course of that time, Jeff survived 2 separate bear attacks, narrowly escaped being gored by a furious buffalo, was struck by lightning on 2 occasions, and even found himself appearing in films alongside some of Hollywood's most legendary names. He also spent a full decade managing a sprawling 15,000-acre ranch, overseeing the care of more than 1,200 buffalo. And it was there, amidst the sweeping prairies and endless horizons, that he would bear witness to the strangest events of his life, occurrences so haunting that they would remain etched upon his very soul. The story begins on a strange, dark night when Jeff Sailors returned to his bed well past midnight. He had spent the day constructing a new fence line on the eastern side of the property before coming back to the ranch house to tend to chores he had been putting off for far too long. He hadn't even sat down to supper until after 10 o'clock. Not that it bothered him. Though he had not been in this position long, he relished the freedom it offered and found himself intoxicated by the vast beauty surrounding him. The summer heat had drained his strength, and after such a grueling day, sleep came easily. But less than 10 minutes later, he was torn from his slumber by the sudden blast of piercing music. Almost instantly, Jeff recognized the opening riffs of Immigrant Song by Led Zeppelin. The sound was so deafening that the very walls and window panes of the house trembled as though they were about to shatter. Still half dazed from being jolted awake, he stumbled down the stairs in a haze before gradually regaining his senses. As far as sound equipment went, he owned little more than a small radio that sat on a shelf in the kitchen. It was utterly incapable of producing such volume, and a quick glance at the living room revealed that the television was switched off as well. Soon it became clear that the uproar was coming from outside, as though the band itself had set up for a midnight concert in his yard. Convinced that someone must have pulled up outside blasting their car stereo, Jeff stormed toward the front door. Yet the moment he opened it, the music ceased. He stepped out onto the porch and cast his gaze around. The night was deathly silent, broken only by the sight of his own pickup truck. The ranch yard was utterly empty. No one else was there. After checking his vehicle, he made his way through the barn and outbuildings, then looked across the wide-open pastures that surrounded the house. But apart from his 2 dogs, there was nothing. For half an hour he searched, before finally returning to bed, confused, unsettled, and more than a little unnerved. The music had to have come from somewhere. And yet, Jeff lived in the center of a sprawling 15,000-acre ranch, in a house nearly 1.5 miles from the nearest county road. Even if someone had somehow bypassed 3 separate locked gates just to reach the property, they would have needed a massive rig of sound equipment to generate the sheer decibels he had heard. None of it made any sense. But then again, very little about this ranch ever did. When Jeff first assumed the role of ranch foreman, he had already heard whispers within the local community, rumors of strange happenings, not only on the land he now managed but also on the neighboring properties. At first, he paid little attention. He was not the type to believe in such things, but within only a few months of moving into the ranch house, he would have his first brush with the inexplicable. One evening, his girlfriend came to stay the night. The two of them had just gone to bed at around 10 o'clock when what had been a calm, peaceful spring night suddenly erupted into chaos. Out of nowhere, a violent gale descended upon the house. Winds hammered the walls with unrelenting force. Rafters groaned under the strain. Picture frames rattled loose and crashed to the floor, and the entire structure shook as though a tornado were bearing down upon it. Knowing full well that the house had no basement, Jeff pulled his girlfriend from the bed and hurried her into the nearest closet. For 2 minutes the storm raged, rising to a deafening crescendo, until Jeff was certain death was upon them, when, as suddenly as it had begun, everything fell silent. It was almost as if someone had flicked a switch. The wind died, the rain and thunder ceased. The house was still again. Stepping cautiously onto the porch, Jeff looked up to find a sky ablaze with stars, not a cloud in sight, and not the faintest trace of a breeze. Deeply shaken, he returned inside, tidied the wreckage, and tried to settle back to sleep. But by morning, things would grow even stranger. At first light, Jeff walked the yard and noticed that the ground had been scoured clean. The house sat at the center of a 4-acre enclosure, with automatic gates at either end. Once a week, the buffalo herd would run through and churn the soil so thoroughly that he could easily spot the tire tracks of any vehicle that happened to pass. Yet when he approached the nearest gate, he saw the tracks of his girlfriend's car on the far side, exactly as they should have been. But on his side, the earth was wiped spotless. Looking closer, he discovered something even more unsettling. A vast circle, 400 feet in diameter, encircled the ranch house, which sat precisely at its center. Every inch of soil within that ring had been swept clean, as though no creature had set foot there for years. Needless to say, from that day forward, Jeff began to pay far closer attention to the rumors he had once dismissed, and it was not long before he found himself repeatedly awakened in the night, sometimes by the thunderous roar of rock music, and other times by the shrill, exotic cries of tropical birds echoing just outside his home. On another night, Jeff had wandered the pastures until late, trying in vain to track the source of those strange bird calls. Eventually, he gave up the search and returned to bed. At first light the following morning, he shuffled downstairs to make a pot of coffee and prepare for another day's work. But as he turned the corner into the kitchen, the sight before him stopped him cold. Spread across the floor was the entire contents of his refrigerator, laid out in a flawless triangular formation nearly 6 feet in length. At the time, Jeff kept 2 dogs, an Australian shepherd named Mooner, who had once saved his life from a charging buffalo, and a small blue heeler pup he was watching for a colleague. Mooner was especially sharp, and whenever anyone turned off the county road, which lay nearly 1.5 miles away, he would erupt in barking to warn Jeff that someone was coming. Yet throughout the night, neither of the dogs had made a sound. There had been no sign at all that an intruder had entered the house. When Jeff tried to let the dogs out to relieve themselves, they flatly refused to step across the kitchen floor, forcing him to lead them through the living room and out the front door instead. Outside, he searched for footprints or any sign of forced entry, but he found nothing. That eerie triangle would prove to be no isolated occurrence. It would become a recurring motif in the series of strange events that plagued the ranch. On one occasion, the ranch manager, who lived about a mile away, telephoned Jeff in the early hours, shaken after waking to discover that every single light in his house had been switched on, even the lamp beside his bed. Jeff agreed to meet him at first light, but when he set out that morning, he discovered something unnerving on his own doorstep. A knife, a fork, and a spoon from his kitchen drawer, arranged into a perfect triangle. Upon further inspection, he found more such triangles laid out with silverware at the entrance to each outbuilding in the yard. Later, he would learn that the very same phenomenon had taken place at the ranch manager's house as well. Had the events remained merely strange and difficult to explain, Jeff might have managed to endure them. But soon they took on a far darker edge when the buffalo herd on the ranch began to die without reason. In March, only 2 months after Jeff had moved in, he discovered the carcass of a bull not far from the ranch yard. He had heard stories of livestock mutilations before, but he had always assumed they were the work of predators, or perhaps malicious acts meant to harm the ranch owner. It did not take long, however, for Jeff to realize that something far more disturbing was taking place. Over the years he spent there, he noticed that the phenomenon always began in March and continued through to October, never once occurring in the winter months. In each case, the carcass was left in a grotesque fashion. If the victim was a cow, An elliptical incision would appear along the underside of the abdomen. Most of the internal organs were removed, yet there was never a single trace of blood. Even more unsettling, every female was pregnant, and in every instance the unborn calf was taken from the womb and placed upon its mother's body. What befell the bulls was even harder to comprehend. In every single case, the genitalia were missing, but the manner in which they were removed was the true mystery. A bull's penis is roughly 3 feet in length, encased entirely within a protective sheath of skin, and yet in each mutilation the organ was cut cleanly at the base, the reven, while the sheath itself remained completely intact. This meant that whoever, or whatever, had carried out the act had somehow reached deep inside the sheath to sever the organ at its root, a feat all but impossible for human hands. In every case, an orange triangle was imprinted somewhere upon the carcass, usually on the head if the victim was male, and on the rib cage if it was female. During Jeff's 9 years as foreman, anywhere from 20 to 30 buffalo were killed each year, causing annual losses of up to $50,000. It was no surprise, then, when the local authorities became involved. At that time, the county sheriff was a man named Wally, well-liked and deeply respected by the community. Because of the staggering number of buffalo deaths each summer, Wally was a frequent visitor to the ranch, where he would witness some of the strangest incidents of his career. One encounter, in fact, proved so terrifying that it led him to resign his post altogether. For years, strange glowing orbs had been reported drifting across the property. Some speculated that these anomalies were the very cause behind the mutilations. Jeff and Wally spent countless nights chasing the lights across the open range, yet the mysterious spheres always eluded them, slipping just out of reach, as though mocking every attempt to uncover their secret. One evening, as Jeff sat in his living room reading, a call came over the radio from Sheriff Wally. He explained that he had a ride along with him that night and wanted to patrol the ranch. Jeff agreed, and about 10 minutes later he saw the glow of the Jeep's headlights sweep across the yard before disappearing into the vast pasture land beyond. Much of the ranch was rolling country, and from time to time Jeff caught glimpses of the beams flickering on the horizon as the vehicle crested hills and dipped into gullies. But about an hour later, the radio suddenly burst into life with Wally's frantic voice shouting that he was surrounded and was pulling out immediately. Then the transmission went dead. Jeff tried repeatedly to raise him, but there was no response. Alarmed, he grabbed his fully loaded AK-47 and stepped out into the yard. Roughly 10 minutes later, he spotted the faint glow of headlights shimmering against the distant horizon, vanishing and reappearing as the Jeep traversed the uneven terrain. Then, as it crested the final ridge, Jeff froze at the sight unfolding before his eyes. Racing toward him was the sheriff's Jeep, pursued by 6 luminous green orbs hovering in a semicircle around the rear of the vehicle. Wally gripped a pistol in each hand, firing wildly to either side as he steered, while his ride-along companion crouched low on the passenger floor in terror. As the Jeep thundered toward the auto gate where Jeff stood, 2 of the orbs vanished into nothing, then the next 2, and finally the last pair dissolved into the night. Without so much as a glance in Jeff's direction, Wally sped past and out onto the county road, leaving Jeff standing in the darkness of the ranch yard, shaken to his core by what he had just witnessed. 5 days later, the sheriff resigned his post. Throughout the course of these bizarre events, the ranch was repeatedly visited by men claiming to represent various federal agencies, the most notable of which was the FBI. On one occasion, several federal agents even stayed on the property, maintaining constant communication with a fixed-wing aircraft that circled at high altitude over the region. For the most part, they kept to themselves, but after some careful conversation, Jeff coaxed a young recruit into admitting that the Bureau knew far more about the situation than they were letting on. When Jeff pressed him, the young man abruptly departed and never returned. A week later, 2 other men arrived, identifying themselves as representatives of a university in Michigan, working under the authority of a federal agency. They explained that they had come to collect necropsy samples from a buffalo recently found mutilated. Unlike the officials before them, the 2 scientists were far more approachable. As it happened, only a few days earlier, a cow had been discovered butchered under mysterious circumstances. Jeff led them to the ravine where the carcasses of dead animals were dumped, and when they examined the latest victim, both men were dumbfounded. They could not fathom how such wounds had been inflicted. Their shock only deepened when they observed the other buffalo remains, desiccated, mummified, and showing no signs of natural decay. Jeff explained that he had spent much of his life around dead animals, both as a hunter and through his work with horses and mules. And until coming to this ranch, he had never seen a carcass left untouched by vultures or blowflies. Yet none of the mutilated buffalo ever attracted scavengers of any kind. The two men collected their samples and departed, but Jeff made sure to ask them to report back should they uncover anything unusual. About a month later, one of the scientists reached out, and the results left Jeff reeling. The blood of the buffalo had crystallized into a toxic state, something Jeff knew could only occur naturally if an animal had been driven to absolute exhaustion before collapsing from heart failure. It suggested that the herd had been terrorized to the point of death. The second revelation was even stranger. Tests on the precise incisions revealed that the hemoglobin had been subjected to heat exceeding 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, over 590 degrees Celsius. They knew this because the structure of hemoglobin undergoes irreversible changes when heated beyond that threshold. Jeff asked whether such a thing could have been caused by a laser, and the scientists admitted that it was the only possible explanation. The problem, however, was that only the US military possessed lasers capable of generating such heat, and deploying them required 2 semi-flatbed trailers to haul the equipment into the field. Yet Jeff, despite being an experienced outdoorsman, had never once seen any sign of such machinery on the ranch. In fact, he had never even found a single footprint near the sites of mutilation. Number 2. The Blackbird of Chernobyl. When researching the countless great catastrophes that have taken place throughout human history, it is not uncommon to encounter testimony from eyewitnesses who insist they were forewarned of the impending calamity through mysterious omens. A day after the Chernobyl disaster, the scenes witnessed by helicopter pilots as they flew over the shattered facility were like something torn from a horror film. Several hundred feet below, the ruins of the power station still smoldered, sending up dense, acrid plumes of smoke that forced the air crews to weave around them as they pressed on toward the target zone. On the ground beneath, rescue workers and soldiers could be seen running to and fro. Many of them were fully aware of the mortal risks they were exposing themselves to, yet carried on regardless, driven by the knowledge that the task before them might mean the difference between saving not just hundreds, but thousands, perhaps even millions of lives. High above, the pilots themselves were no safer from the invisible cloud of radiation blanketing the area. Lacking video cameras or any form of specialized equipment, each helicopter was forced to dive in at speed, its crew blindly dumping tons of sand in the desperate hope of quenching the fire raging within the reactor's core. Sergeant Valery Semyonov stared impassively down at the hellish landscape below and realized that no matter how much water he swallowed, the sickening metallic taste at the back of his throat would not go away. Like most of his comrades, he had little faith in the safety protocols they had been ordered to follow. It was the final sortie of the day, and as the pilots signaled for their descent, Semyonov braced himself to heave yet more heavy sacks of sand onto the deadly ruins beneath them. But as he reached across to open the side door of the aircraft, his entire world suddenly turned upside down. Without warning, the helicopter lurched violently, hurling Semyonov into a stack of sacks before rebounding and slamming his head against the side of the cabin. Cursing under his breath, he checked to see if blood was flowing from where he had struck the airframe, then stormed forward toward the cockpit, ready to vent his anger on the pilots. Even above the deafening roar of the rotor blades, he could hear shouting. He froze in his tracks when he caught sight of the pilots' faces. Both were pale with terror. Their only response to his furious demands was a helpless look and frantic pointing toward the windscreen. Peering out into the smoke-choked sky ahead, Semyonov caught sudden movement. A jet-black shape hurtled out of the haze, slashing across their flight path. For the briefest instant, he saw curved talons, shark-like teeth, and a pair of glowing crimson eyes before, with a shriek and a violent flap of its wings, the creature vanished back into the smoke. Semyonov was not the only rescue worker to see the apparition that day, but he would be among the last. The terrifying vision seared itself into his memory, a memory he would carry to his grave, his death coming far sooner than expected, as a result of the lethal dose of radiation he had unknowingly absorbed. Within mere hours of the catastrophe, the creature had already been given a name, the Blackbird of Chernobyl. Between 1972 and 1983, 4 RBMK reactors were constructed at a site located roughly 10 miles northwest of the town, with 2 additional units scheduled to be built in the near future. For nearly 15 years, the facility carried out its task of providing power for the people of Ukraine without incident. That was until the early months of 1986, when plant managers began to receive unusual reports from several of their employees. Many claim to have seen a shadowy figure lingering near the perimeter fence late at night, seemingly watching them as they departed after finishing their shifts. At first, these accounts were largely dismissed, until one evening, when a terrified female worker burst into the security office, sobbing and screaming that she had just seen a strange creature near the car park. Through her tears, she explained that as she had been walking toward her vehicle, she heard a rustling sound in the branches of some nearby trees. Suddenly, a pair of glowing, ruby-red eyes had opened in the darkness. A chilling hiss followed, and from within the canopy a gigantic bird-like entity had erupted, soaring into the night sky. Within days of her testimony, others began to come forward with similar stories. Two maintenance workers arriving for an early morning shift reported seeing a huge dark figure with vast wings circling the plant in the dawn light before it shrieked and vanished. Another employee, driving home late one evening, nearly lost control of his vehicle when he swerved violently to avoid a monstrous shape that swooped out of the darkness into the beam of his headlights. Facility officials remained skeptical of these accounts, citing the lack of any tangible evidence. But then the nightmares began. A significant number of workers either arrived late or left early, claiming they felt too unwell to continue their shifts. It soon became clear that most of them were struggling with their sleep, tormented by dreams of a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes and wings spanning more than 20 feet. Staff who were caught openly discussing the dark apparition were threatened with suspension, while those who called in sick began receiving phone calls at home ordering them to return to work and cease spreading rumors. Some of the callers even identified themselves as KGB agents or operatives from other intelligence services. Yet, despite the threats, the strange reports continued to surface. In the early hours of April 26th, all safety protocols for reactor number 4 were deliberately disregarded by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov during a pre-planned exercise designed to simulate a power outage. Because the reactor had been running at half capacity for 10 hours, it had become choked with xenon, causing the power output to drop to nearly zero, a state that rendered the test useless. In order to bring the power level back up, Dyatlov ordered the engineers to withdraw nearly all of the control rods and to cease pumping coolant into the core. This caused the reactivity inside the core to surge at a dangerous rate. The engineers, panicking, attempted to shut the reactor down by reinserting the control rods. Unfortunately, those rods were tipped with graphite, a fatal design flaw, which caused the chain reaction to skyrocket, culminating in a massive explosion. It became the worst nuclear disaster in human history, instantly contaminating the surrounding region with catastrophic levels of radiation. Desperately short of specialized equipment to deal with the unfolding crisis, the Soviet authorities could do little more than call upon the military in a frantic attempt to contain the growing danger. Brave but poorly equipped infantrymen were ordered to sprint into the shattered buildings to clear radioactive debris, limited to no more than 90 seconds on site in order to avoid a lethal dose of radiation. Military and civilian helicopters were drafted in from as far afield as Siberia, tasked with dumping thousands of tons of absorbent material onto the smoldering reactor. Without adequate shielding, many of the 600 pilots and crew members would perish far earlier than expected, their lives cut short by the radiation-induced illnesses they had unwittingly contracted. Within only a few days, it became apparent that some of those involved in the rescue effort had also encountered the same terrifying entity that had haunted the plant's workers in the weeks before. Military commanders received numerous reports from soldiers and pilots describing a vast, winged creature circling the site, weaving in and out of the smoke plumes and swooping low over the heads of those laboring on the ground. As the last of the fires were finally extinguished, the reports steadily diminished and then ceased altogether. No photographs of the creature were ever taken, but over the 8 months required to construct a concrete sarcophagus around the ruined reactor, a chilling realization emerged. Every single individual, civilian or military, who had reported contact with the so-called Blackbird had died from radiation poisoning. Lacking definitive evidence, many dismissed the tale as nothing more than an urban legend. Yet the story endured, despite the deaths of all who had claimed to witness it. One factor that lends weight to the legend is its striking similarity to the Mothman sightings in West Virginia during the 1960s. Residents of Point Pleasant at that time reported eerie encounters with a strange nocturnal creature whose appearance was almost identical to that of the Blackbird. This frightening figure was said to chase pedestrians and vehicles, and was even blamed for killing a dog. The final sightings took place immediately before the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which spanned the Ohio River and buckled under rush hour traffic on December 15th, 1967, claiming 46 lives. After that tragedy, the Mothman was never seen again, leading locals to believe the creature was inextricably linked to the disaster, and perhaps had even tried to warn them. Commentators have speculated that the entity encountered at Chernobyl and at Point Pleasant may in fact have been the same, serving as a harbinger of doom. Its appearances prior to the reactor's destruction have been interpreted as a warning to the plant's workers of the impending catastrophe. Meanwhile, its manifestations before rescue personnel in the aftermath have been seen as an omen that they would not survive. The Blackbird is far from the only supernatural tale to emerge from the ruins of Chernobyl. In the wake of the accident, a 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established around the plant, later expanded to cover an even wider area. During that time, the few soldiers and scientists allowed entry reported seeing strange figures moving across their night vision and thermal imaging cameras, the figures that would vanish the instant anyone attempted to approach them. In 1997, a team of physicists from an American university was granted access to the exclusion zone in order to assist in evaluating the effectiveness of the safeguarding measures that had been put in place. At the time, there were mounting concerns that the integrity of the sarcophagus, the massive concrete structure built over the ruined core, was deteriorating, raising the possibility of yet another radioactive leak. One of the academics, Andrei Sukhov, reported that while he was inspecting the exterior of the thick concrete shell alone, he suddenly became aware of noises emanating from within. He insisted that he could clearly hear what sounded like human voices crying out for help. Yet when he summoned the escorting soldiers to listen, the sounds abruptly ceased. As for the encounters with the strange creature, it is possible that some leakage had occurred at the plant even before the reactor explosion, its effects causing staff to suffer from hallucinations. In fact, in 1982, Reactor Number 1 had experienced a partial meltdown, though the incident was covered up by the Soviet authorities. It has been suggested that once the chilling stories of a mysterious prowler began to circulate, the human mind was inevitably influenced, leading workers to believe they too had seen the Blackbird. Likewise, the pilots and soldiers who later arrived at the site may have already heard such rumors, and in their exhausted and fearful mental states, convinced themselves that they had witnessed it as well. The official explanation put forward by the Soviet government was that the witnesses had merely seen a local bird known as the black stork. This large, endangered species can grow to nearly 1 meter in height, with a wingspan approaching 2 meters. When glimpsed fleetingly in the darkness or through the murky haze of smoke-filled skies, it is not difficult to imagine how the human mind might transform it into something far more terrifying, particularly given how unusual such a sight would have been under those conditions. Ultimately, the most plausible theory may be that the creature was nothing more than an internet legend, woven together in the decades since the disaster and deliberately tied to the stories of the Mothman of Point Pleasant, not only to bolster its credibility, but also to connect it with those earlier American encounters. Despite the notorious difficulty of gaining access to the old Soviet archives, the truth is that there is little hard evidence to support the claims. With no surviving eyewitnesses to question and no physical proof of any kind, the likelihood is that the entire story is a fabrication. And yet, who can say with certainty, perhaps there is still something hidden deep within these enduring legends. Number 3. The Legend of the Bell Witch. Wherever tales of mysterious creatures exist, every community carries its own folklore. Now, we journey to a small town in Tennessee that was once haunted by a spirit so vengeful that it became the very first ghost in United States history to be blamed for a death, the legend of the Bell Witch. Nestled on the outskirts of bustling Nashville lies the small town of Adams, Tennessee. Like thousands of other towns scattered across the United States, it is quiet, peaceful, and easily overlooked by travelers. Yet, if one peers more closely into its past, a darker story emerges, one of a haunting that began more than 2 centuries ago and is said to continue even to this very day. In the year 1804, John Bell, together with his wife Lucy Williams Bell and approximately 10 other families, embarked upon a grueling journey from Edgecombe, North Carolina, to Red River, Tennessee. Over the following years, the Bell family established themselves as prosperous farmers, thriving in their new home. Although widely respected and admired by the community, a scandal in the mid-1810s would cast a shadow of suspicion over John Bell's character. Among the families that had also moved from North Carolina was the Batts household. Following a tragic accident, their relationship with the Bells soured into lasting enmity. In 1816, Frederick Batts, the head of the family, was gravely injured while working his farm and would remain permanently impaired for the rest of his life. Unable to continue laboring, his family's situation became desperate, forcing him to sell parcels of land simply to survive. Some of that land was purchased by John Bell. This transaction ignited what would become an endless feud between the two families. Frederick's wife, Kate Batts, accused Bell of exploiting their misfortune, declaring that he had acquired the property for far less than its true worth. She swore that Bell and his family would one day pay dearly for his actions. The hostility only deepened when Bell later purchased a young enslaved girl from Frederick's brother, Benjamin. At the time, Bell felt the girl was too young to take with him, and so left her with her mother for a while longer. But when he eventually returned to collect her, Benjamin reneged on the agreement, insisting that she was worth more than the payment already received. After much heated dispute, Bell resold the girl back to Benjamin at a higher price, profiting yet again at the expense of the Batts family's hardship. By this point, John Bell believed the matter resolved and hoped that his dealings with the Batts were at an end. Unfortunately, nothing could have been further from the truth. Soon after the issue of the enslaved girl was settled, Benjamin Batts secretly filed a lawsuit against him for extortion. Bell had no knowledge of the suit and therefore failed to appear in court. In his absence, judgment was awarded to Benjamin. Word of the ruling swiftly reached Red River and was announced before the local church. Although Bell protested, the decision led to his excommunication, an act that many would later say opened the door for evil to enter his household. With her husband crippled, Kate Batts rose to prominence as the head of her family. Loud, coarse, and spiteful, she was widely disliked within the community. Because of certain questionable behaviors in church, many also believed Kate was engaged in witchcraft. Some even suspected that her husband's tragedy had been divine punishment for such wicked practices. Though none dared accuse her openly, most townsfolk avoided Kate whenever possible. She seemed far too intimidating for anyone to confront. In the year 1817, not long after his excommunication, John Bell was out hunting on his land when he encountered a creature unlike anything he had ever seen before. He later described it as having the body of a large dog, the head of a rabbit, and being covered entirely in black fur. Startled, he raised his musket and fired, but when he went to inspect the spot, the creature had vanished without leaving the faintest trace. Not wishing to alarm his family, Bell chose to keep the matter to himself. Yet soon after this encounter, strange phenomena began to plague the household. At night, the Bells would hear what sounded like stones being hurled against the exterior walls of their home. Despite checking repeatedly, they never once found an intruder. At first, Bell suspected the Batts family, but the disturbances quickly escalated to inside the house itself. Loud thuds, scratchings along the floors and walls, and noises like rats gnawing at the legs of the beds. These torments continued throughout the night, yet their origin was never discovered. The family's sleep was shattered, though they tried their best to ignore it. The manifestations soon escalated into physical assaults. One night, Elizabeth Betsy Bell, the 14-year-old daughter, was roused from sleep by the now familiar noises. When she tried to investigate, she discovered that her hair had been twisted into tight knots around the bedpost. Unable to free herself, she was then struck repeatedly across the face by an unseen force. Hearing her terrified screams, the family rushed to her room and found Betsy's face covered in red welts, the shape of handprints clearly visible. Before long, the youngest son also began to show similar marks and bruises upon his legs and face. Not wishing to make the matter public and further damage the family's reputation, John Bell instructed everyone to remain silent. They turned to prayer, begging to be freed from the torment of whatever evil force haunted them, but their pleas went unanswered. In the weeks that followed, visual apparitions began to appear. The enslaved workers reported seeing strange birds and beasts, some of which they claimed could even speak. While walking through a field, Betsy herself witnessed the vision of a young girl in a green dress, suspended by her hands from a tree branch, who then vanished without a trace. The specters, the noises, and the physical assaults grew more violent with each passing day. Fear and sleepless nights soon became a burden far too great for the Bell family to endure on their own. John Bell turned to his friend and neighbor, James Johnston, for help. Johnston agreed, and soon he and his wife came to the Bell home, joining the family in prayer. One evening, Johnston raised his voice and demanded to know the name of the entity. After several nights of unsuccessful attempts to drive it away, Johnston advised Bell to seek the support of the wider community, and Bell reluctantly agreed. News of the haunted house spread faster than anyone could have imagined. People from nearby settlements, and even from far afield, traveled to the Bell residence in hopes of witnessing the strange phenomena. The entity, once quiet, now made no effort to conceal its presence. It displayed a particular malice toward John Bell. Eventually, word reached General Andrew Jackson, who would later become President of the United States. Jackson resolved to bring a small group of soldiers with him to the Bell farm, where they intended to camp for several days. One of the men boasted that he had brought along silver bullets and declared his intention to use them to kill the witch. Yet, as the party drew close to the Bell property, the wheels of their wagon suddenly locked, refusing to move despite the combined efforts of soldiers and horses alike. Jackson is said to have apologized for the arrogance of his man, and at once the wheels turned freely again, allowing the group to arrive without further difficulty. Although they had planned to stay several nights, Jackson's company departed after only one. While no official records survive, it was later said that Jackson remarked, "I would rather face the entire British Army than spend another night at the Bell House." Not all members of the Bell family were tormented by the so-called Bell Witch, however. Lucy Bell, John's wife, received quite the opposite treatment. In the year 1820, she was diagnosed with a severe case of pleurisy, and many doubted she would survive. As Lucy lay bedridden, the Bell Witch was said to sing soothing hymns by her side, and even left hazelnuts and grapes upon her bed, appearing to conjure them from thin air. Gradually, Lucy's condition improved until she made a full recovery. As Lucy's health grew stronger, John Bell's declined with alarming speed. On the morning of December the 20th, 1820, he was found dead in his bed. A strange, pungent odor emanated from his mouth, and a vial of cloudy liquid was discovered nearby, giving off the same acrid scent. Rumors quickly spread as to who had poisoned him, and when some whispered that Lucy herself might have been responsible, the disembodied voice of Kate was heard declaring, "Last night I fixed his medicine and gave him a heavy dose. He will never rise from that bed again." For the first time in United States history, a documented death was attributed to a supernatural entity. Nor did it end there. Kate was said to have made an appearance at John Bell's funeral. During the burial service, she mocked him, jeering and singing drinking songs to torment his grieving family and friends. After the service, the disturbances gradually diminished. It seemed Kate had accomplished her purpose, and the family believed she was gone for good. That was until the spring of 1821, when Betsy Bell received a marriage proposal from a well-respected young man named Joshua Gardner. Once again, Betsy saw the vision of the girl in the tree, who warned her not to wed this man before vanishing as suddenly as she had appeared. Terrified of inviting the Bell Witch's return, Betsy broke off the engagement. So, how are we to view this story? Given the sparse record-keeping of that era, we will never truly know the full truth of the events that are said to have taken place. It must be remembered that most people of the time could neither read nor write, and so the majority of the accounts were passed down orally for many years before ever being committed to paper. It is difficult, therefore, to determine how many details were embellished, or even entirely invented, before they were finally recorded. The Bell Witch haunting endured for many years, producing far more tales and incidents than we can recount here. Yet it remains entirely possible that much of the story was constructed as a means of concealing the murder of John Bell. It is worth noting that Lucy Bell, John's wife, was the younger sister of John Williams Jr., who was himself the father of Kate Williams Batts. Could Bell's death have been the result of a conspiracy between Kate and Lucy? This would certainly explain why Lucy escaped the witch's torment. But then, what possible gain could Lucy have derived from subjecting her own children to such terror? Records show that Kate Batts was still alive in the census of 1830, and so it could not have been her ghost at the heart of these incidents. Another figure often mentioned is Richard Powell, the man who would later become Betsy's husband. Powell was highly educated and may have been capable of producing strange occurrences that the people of that era could not easily comprehend, thereby creating mass hysteria. He had long harbored affection for Betsy, even while still married to his wife Esther, who died in 1821, the very same year that Joshua Gardner had proposed to Betsy. Could Powell have orchestrated these events as a way of drawing closer to her? It seems unlikely, yet not beyond all possibility. On the other hand, there are those who believe that the entire saga was genuine, that Kate Batts had conjured a spirit or demon to avenge the perceived injustices against her family. Even today, unexplained events are said to occur in the region. Local residents, including descendants of the Bell family, have spoken of strange experiences that defy simple explanation. As a young boy, Bob Bell recalled an incident involving his grandmother. In a state of panic, she telephoned Bob's father, begging him to come and investigate the house for intruders. When they arrived, they found nothing amiss until they entered the kitchen. The cabinet that housed the family's china, which had always been kept locked, now stood open, and every dish and plate lay scattered across the floor. Strangely, not a single piece had been chipped or broken. A more recent occurrence involved Tim Henson, a local historian and curator at the town's museum. According to Henson, visitors to the Bell property are frequently warned not to remove anything from the site. He recounted the story of one man who took a stone from a nearby cave. Within the space of 3 days, the man lost his wife, his job, and his home. It is, of course, entirely possible that these tragedies would have happened regardless, and that the taking of the stone was mere coincidence. But then again, who can say for certain? So, should you ever find yourself in Red River and take the time to speak with the townsfolk, you may not leave as a believer. But it is to be hoped that you will be wise enough to give the old Bell property the respect it so rightly deserves. Number 4. Man lost in the Himalayas. In December of 1991, a man set off into the Himalayas on what was meant to be a week-long trek. Yet when 7 days had passed, he had still not returned. What he would endure in the weeks that followed became one of the most prolonged and grueling ordeals ever recorded in the history of that rugged land. In September of 1991, James Scott, an Australian medical student, held a plane ticket bound for Nepal and had convinced his close friend, Tim Hooper, to join him on the journey. His hope was to persuade a hospital there to allow him a temporary placement, which would enable him to fulfill the final requirement for his graduation. As it turned out, he would not need to persuade anyone at all. Just before he was due to depart, a letter arrived with an invitation to begin his elective. The hospital informed him that he could start his residency at the end of December that same year. For the 22-year-old, finally receiving the long-awaited reply felt like a gift. At the time, James was excelling at a prestigious medical school, earning top marks, and he had already met the woman he intended to marry upon his return to Australia. Everything seemed to be going his way, and although it meant leaving behind his family and fiancé for a time, he was eager for the adventure that awaited him in South Asia. James was not exactly a thrill seeker, but he had always enjoyed keeping active. He trained regularly, whether hiking, tackling Australia's most rugged cycling terrain, or pursuing his true passion, karate. He had earned a black belt and competed at the national level. In 1989, he won his weight class at the Queensland Championships and later that year placed third in the Australian Championships. All this spoke to his strength, endurance, and ability to take care of himself. Although his placement would not begin until December, James flew to Nepal in September with Tim to settle in. He visited the hospital a few times, meeting the doctors and nurses he would soon work alongside, and they quickly grew familiar with him as well. When some of them learned of his enthusiasm for physical activity, they encouraged him to make the most of his free time before his residency by trekking through the nearby Himalayas. For an avid hiker like James, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Yet while he loved to walk long distances, he was no mountaineer. In fact, he had a fear of heights, which made the prospect of summiting a peak like Everest entirely out of the question. Fortunately, the Himalayas offered a variety of terrain far more suited to him. After settling in Kathmandu, James and Tim wasted little time in planning a trek along the Jomsom Trail, a popular route that takes more than a week to complete, winding through forests, rocky landscapes, and even some of the deepest gorges on Earth. Because this was no mere day hike, the two men wanted to be properly prepared. They secured supplies, hired 2 porters to carry much of their gear, and engaged a guide to lead them. When the day of departure finally arrived, James and Tim soon discovered it to be an adventure filled with wonder. Day by day, they climbed as high as 9,800 feet, around 3,000 meters, and were rewarded with some of the most spectacular views on Earth. At that elevation, the air was cold, but not nearly as harsh as they had braced themselves for. They even passed trekkers clad in nothing more than ski jackets and sneakers. Before long, James and Tim began to feel almost foolish for having prepared so thoroughly. Just a few days into the journey, they decided to send their guide and 2 porters back to Kathmandu with most of the gear, choosing to continue on with only their light backpacks. Several days later, the pair returned to Kathmandu, elated after successfully completing their trek in the Himalayas. The trip had gone so smoothly that they immediately began planning another before James was due to start his residency. The problem was that this next journey would begin in late December, a season wholly different from September. This time, they set their sights on the Helambu Trail, a more challenging route but one with lodges scattered along the way, where trekkers could eat and rest. By the time December arrived, they had made their final preparations, carrying only what could be packed into their rucksacks. On December 21st, they set out and reached their first lodge, where they encountered a group of German hikers making their way back along the Helambu Trail. According to them, the trek was not especially difficult, but the scenery was underwhelming, which gave James and Tim second thoughts. James pulled out the map of Nepal he carried. Like many older maps in developing countries, it was outdated, though it still offered a sense of alternative routes. After looking it over, the Germans produced a far newer and more accurate version, and generously left it with James and Tim. With this new map in hand, the two decided to aim for the Gosenkund Trail, a spur off the Helambu route that did not appear on the older chart. The following morning, they rose early and happened upon another traveler, a man named Mark Fulton. At once they recognized his Australian accent, and the three quickly became companions. Mark had originally planned to take the Helambu Trail as well, but James and Tim persuaded him that it was not worth the effort based on what they had heard from the Germans. One of the three then suggested they attempt the Gosenkund route instead, and the decision was made. Together they continued along Helambu toward the intersection with their new path. Along the way, Tim suffered a leg injury. Though he tried to push through the pain, he finally admitted he could not go on. He stopped and told the others that he would return to Kathmandu. James offered to accompany him, but Tim insisted that he continue with Mark and finish the trek. It was clear that James wanted very much to press forward, so the two friends agreed to meet again for dinner on Christmas Eve at their favorite restaurant. Before parting, Tim asked for one of the maps. In a moment of absent-mindedness, James handed over the newer one, the map the Germans had given them, marked with the Gosenkund spur. Tim also forgot to return the one lighter they had between them, in case James and Mark should need to start a fire. Even so, James and Mark carried on, camping that night at roughly 9,800 feet. The next day they reached an area known as Tharapati, where the junction to Gosenkund lay. There they encountered several groups of trekkers descending from the trail. They stopped to talk, and James and Mark learned that while the path was challenging, there was no snow, which made the journey far easier. Reassured, the two thanked them and pressed on to the next lodge, but at dawn the following morning, they awoke to an unwelcome surprise. Snow had fallen throughout the night. Though it was only a thin layer, the heavy cloud cover above unsettled them. They asked the lodgekeeper if more snow was expected that day. He replied that none was forecast, and assured them they should be able to make it over the pass without difficulty. At around 7:30, James and Mark left the lodge. At first, the trail offered them sweeping, majestic views, but conditions soon changed with startling speed. The temperature dropped, dark clouds rolled in, and then the snow began to fall in heavy flakes. The great white crystals obscured their vision and quickly built up beneath their feet. In no time, the snow was more than 5 inches deep, completely covering the path. James grew uneasy, thinking they ought to turn back, but before he could say anything, he and Mark had somehow strayed to opposite sides of a creek and lost sight of each other. It took 15 minutes of shouting across the storm before they reunited. James immediately voiced his concern, but Mark remained calm, convinced that he could find the route back to Kathmandu. James was not so sure. Choosing what seemed the safest course, he resolved to retrace their steps to the lodge where they had spent the previous night. Mark, however, decided to press forward. After a brief exchange, the two parted ways. James turned back, following their footprints, but the snow fell so thickly that the tracks vanished almost at once. Soon he was completely disoriented. Landmarks were scarce, and the snow reduced visibility to less than 30 feet. James was lost. Believing the nearby creek must eventually lead to some habitation, he chose to follow it. Consulting his old map, he saw that it flowed toward the town of Talu. After 4 hours of walking, he realized the valley had narrowed, the sheer rock walls drawing ever closer. Ahead, several tributaries joined to form a small river. James pressed on, only to find the way barred by a waterfall. Still hoping for a way down, he crept to the edge and peered over. At once he knew he was in trouble. The fall was roughly 100 feet, around 30 meters, an impossible descent. Going down was out of the question, and turning back was far from certain. There was only one option left, to climb upward. Though not a mountaineer, James thought that if he could reach high enough, he might rise above the clouds and wait for the weather to clear. Over the next 2 hours, he clawed his way up, clinging to slick ledges, inch by inch, until he finally hauled himself over the crest, utterly spent. Yet that reckless choice brought a small stroke of fortune. At the top, he found a rocky overhang that offered some shelter. It may sound counterintuitive, but once inside, James stripped off his wet clothing, took out his towel, and dried himself from head to toe. He had spent hours in the freezing cold, his garments soaked through. He reasoned it was safer to be cold and dry than to remain damp. When finished, he curled up beneath the overhang and passed the night there. The next morning, James rose early and set out once more in a desperate attempt to escape. He discovered another creek and followed its course, but the snow was so deep that progress was agonizingly slow. After 2 hours, he had covered barely a single kilometer. The gully he walked in was not as sheer as the one before, but its walls were coated in ice and snow, treacherously slick. Each time he tried to climb out, he slid back down to the floor. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he was exhausted but managed to find another rocky recess in which to pass the night. As before, he stripped, dried himself, and dressed in a dry set of clothing. This time, however, he realized his feet were entirely numb. He lay down again, but the cold that night was far more brutal than before. At one point he was certain he would not survive until dawn. In despair, he sat up, reached into his pack, and pulled out a pen and notebook. He began to write a letter to his family. When it was finished, he closed the book, placed it aside, and lay down once more, resigned to whatever fate awaited him. On December 29th, 5 days after James was meant to meet Tim for dinner in Kathmandu, the telephone rang at the Brisbane home of Joanne Robertson, James's elder sister. Her husband answered, and not long after he came downstairs with grim news. Tim had sent a fax to James's parents, reporting that James was missing. The message sent Joanne into a panic, uncertain what she should do. Her first thought was to board a plane to Nepal at once, but by then the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs was already aware of James's disappearance and urged her to remain where she was. Instead, they advised her to reach out to Carl Harrison, a mountaineering expert based in Kathmandu, to organize a search. The next day, Carl and the first rescue team set out, while James's family at home waited anxiously. They hoped at any moment the phone might ring with word that James was merely stranded at a lodge along the trail. But day after day, that call never came. Joanne pressed the department for updates constantly. On January 2nd, 1992, there was finally a lead. The search party had received a report from a group of French-Canadian trekkers who claimed they had seen a lone hiker, and they were 99% certain it had been James. Relieved, Joanne immediately phoned her parents with the good news. But the torment of waiting in vain was too much for her to endure. The following day, she secured a travel visa, and on January 7th, Joanne boarded a flight bound for South Asia. By the time she arrived in Kathmandu, James had been missing for 16 days. During that span, James had tried multiple times to escape the Himalayas, only to be forced back each time to his rocky shelter by deep snow or sudden blizzards. With nothing more than 2 chocolate bars that were quickly gone, he was compelled to eat snow to survive. Soon he realized that walking out was impossible. At last, he understood that his only real chance of survival lay in being spotted by a helicopter or waiting for the spring thaw, still months away. Awake, James thought of food. Asleep, he dreamed of it. But after 2 weeks of subsisting on snow alone, his hunger slowly ebbed. He relied on the discipline instilled in him through karate, focusing his mind with meticulous attention to techniques and movements, anything to keep despair at bay. The one thing that broke this mental rhythm was the condition of his feet. He had long since lost all feeling in them, and no matter what he did, nothing could restore warmth. One day, pulling off his shoes and socks, he saw that his feet had turned a dark, lifeless blue. Panicked, he opened his medical kit and took out a pair of dissection scissors. He jabbed the blades into the side of his foot. Blood welled up immediately, yet he felt no pain at all. Terror surged through him. Even if he survived this ordeal, he might well lose his feet. But worse still, another horror soon made itself known. A grim reminder that in the Himalayas, man was not at the top of the food chain. One afternoon, James was jolted awake by the terrifying cries of an animal. He pushed the sleeping bag from over his head and looked toward the slope above. Some 30 meters away, a thicket was shaking violently. Before he could comprehend what was happening, a massive dark figure burst forth, a Himalayan black bear, its eyes fixed squarely on him. James gripped the dissection scissors in his hand and shouted defiantly, daring the beast to charge. In that instant, he lost all restraint. his only thought being to let the bear end his suffering quickly. But instead of advancing, the creature turned in fright, scrambling back up the slope until it vanished from view. Though spared, James lived in dread for the next 5 nights, constantly hearing the sound of a bear prowling near his rocky shelter. Meanwhile, rescue efforts continued to falter. Several search parties pushed into the Himalayas only to be forced back by unforgiving terrain. Some even became lost themselves. In Nepal, Joanne, James's sister, was now closer to the search area, yet still powerless. She sought out the French-Canadian trekkers who had earlier reported seeing James. When she met them, most were convinced the man they had seen was indeed her brother, but one woman in the group disagreed. She recalled having spoken to a lone German trekker a few days earlier, and believed that he, not James, was the man in question. Her doubts proved correct when search leaders later received a letter from a German hiker confirming that he had been traveling alone on the Helambu Trail. The news nearly extinguished Joanne's fragile hope. By then, James had been missing for 21 days, and despair was closing in. It was then that Joanne remembered a conversation she had upon first arriving in Kathmandu. A local woman, upon hearing her story, had suggested she seek out a Buddhist lama. To Joanne, as an Australian, the idea seemed strange, but the woman insisted that lamas could see what others could not. At first, Joanne dismissed the suggestion, but as the search grew ever more desperate, she decided she had nothing to lose. She found a lama, explained the situation, and showed him a map of the region where James was believed to have disappeared. After listening, the lama closed his eyes in prayer for a few moments, then bent over the map. He pointed to a specific area, a triangle formed by the towns of Fedi, Gopta, and Talu, and declared that the searchers should focus there. This was a region with almost no trails leading into it. Still, the lama spoke with certainty. James was there. Before leaving, Joanne asked if they would find her brother alive. The lama's reply was simple: she would see him again. At the same time, a more practical line of inquiry was pursued, tracing the whereabouts of Mark. Search teams had still not located him, and there was growing concern that he too had become lost in the mountains. Tim reported that Mark had been due to fly to Thailand after Christmas and then return to Australia before January 21st. The Australian embassy left a message for Mark at the airport, and on January 15th, he telephoned Joanne. Mark explained that he had escaped the Himalayas by finding a trail that led down to a village. He told her that he and James had parted ways somewhere between Fedi and Gopte. This meant that James had headed southwest, a direction the search parties had never explored. If he had continued along that course, he would have been situated precisely within the triangle the lama had indicated on the map. After 30 days trapped in the Himalayas, James at last heard the first sign of a search effort. From far off came a faint, rattling sound. At first he mistook it for the wind, but gradually it grew clearer, the thump of helicopter blades. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag and staggered into a clearing. Waving the bag above his head, he yanked down his trousers to reveal bright red thermal underwear, hoping the vivid color might make him easier to spot. He judged the aircraft to be about 10 kilometers away. He watched it circle for several minutes before it finally turned and disappeared. It was one of the most despairing moments since he had first gone astray. By then, James was only a shadow of his former self, the muscular young man, reduced to something skeletal and frail. In that moment, he even considered ending it all. What held him back was a single thought: that one day his body would be found, and his family would understand how much he had suffered before death claimed him. So, even with survival chances close to zero, James pressed on. On the 42nd day in the Himalayas, he once again heard the sound of a helicopter. For 20 minutes it circled above, while James waved until he collapsed into the snow from exhaustion. Moments later, it dipped down into the valley and vanished again. But this time, he was certain he had been seen. He also knew it would take 4 days for a rescue team to reach him on foot, which meant he might not live long enough to endure. At the rescue command post, Joanne waited as she did every day. Suddenly, the radio crackled with a voice. They had found James, and he was alive. The rescuer repeated it twice, for the words seemed impossible to believe on the first hearing. Joanne was struck dumb with emotion. Later, when the helicopter returned, Carl and the rescue party set out. Beneath the rocky overhang high above the valley, James lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the same familiar sounds he had endured for more than 40 days. Then, a third sound intruded, the voice of a man calling from the distance. He thought he was hallucinating from hypothermia, convinced death was at hand, but the voices grew closer, Drawing a deep breath, James shouted back with all his strength. To his astonishment, a whistle answered. From beneath the ledge, he heard footsteps crunching in the snow, then saw two men lean down to look in. One of them asked, "Are you James Scott, the Australian?" James answered, "Yes." The two immediately scrambled down to embrace him, overcome with joy. One stared at him and exclaimed, "You are a miracle." James asked why, and the man replied, no one had ever survived in that region for more than 10 days. Yet James had endured 43. The following morning, a helicopter arrived. They strapped him in and lifted him out. At the landing site, Joanne waited in breathless anticipation. When the aircraft touched down, several rescuers disembarked first, helping James to the ground. He immediately moved toward Joanne, and she ran to meet him. Brother and sister clung to one another in a moment of pure, overwhelming relief. Joanne could scarcely recognize her own brother, and it would be the last time for many weeks that James could walk on his own before being taken into hospital care. Yet in time, he made a full recovery. The strangest part of all was this: the place where James was found was precisely the spot the llama had indicated on the map. If you found this video compelling, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next story. And do not forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly value hearing from you.